Hello, everyone. This is another episode of Fire Breathing Rob here on the YouTube podcast. And thank you guys for listening. If you've heard us on one of our 10 radio stations where we broadcast, I greatly appreciate that. And also, please like, subscribe, comment, and share our podcast all over you can. We interview a lot of interesting people with amazing stories, which is the Convo Couch by Craig Pasta and Fiorella Isabel. And they've really taught me a lot, especially in this election, about voter suppression. And we're going to talk about that and other issues. So, Fiorella, thanks so much for being on the program. Greatly appreciate having you.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, no problem. No problem.
Right.
It's been busy.
I understand, especially with the coronavirus and all the stuff going on in the political world. So thanks for taking your time to do this. I wanted to ask of you, first of all, to explain about the Convo Coach. How did you guys get started? Can you tell the viewers about that and what the show is about?
So we were both involved in entertainment. We're in Los Angeles. And when 2015 came about, there was Bernie Sanders, and he kind of drew our attention to all of the inconsistencies and all of the just all of the things that were out of order in our country. And so he obviously 2016 went by, and then we decided after that. We were friends. We had met working at a restaurant, but we were in entertainment, and so we had decided, hey, why don't we do a podcast together? Because we had I had wanted to do one for a long time, and so Pasta came back from Florida because he was over there taking care of his family, and then he came back, and we started it, and we started doing it once a week first at an actual studio, and then eventually we got our own studio in our house, and then we were roommates, and so we do it all the time now, as much as possible. And basically what we try to be is just a grassroots media type of show where we talk about progressive topics. And I say progressive, but it's really just anything that anybody should be talking about. It's pretty much just news that's focused on that the mainstream media won't cover. Anything from like local politics to state politics to national and foreign issues. We do a lot of foreign policy as well. And it's things that people, MSNBC, CNN won't talk about. It's things that they refuse to talk about, or if they talk about it, they have a spin on it. So our whole goal is to really tell the truth in an unbiased manner and just have discussions about things that are pertinent for people to know.
And how is the leadership, in your opinion, as far as Gavin Newsom as the governor, been so far throughout the coronavirus?
So Gavin Newsom shut down pretty much the state as far as the shelter in place is what's taking place right now. And that's pretty much means that you can only go outside for if you have a job and you're an essential worker, like if you're like somebody in the hospital or somebody that is still out there, like there's a grocery store worker still working, certain people, or you're going to get food and you have a receipt. I mean, I haven't really been going out very much at all. Most people I know have been pretty respectful of it here. Initially, people weren't taking it seriously because the United States, or the CDC, everybody has a tendency to overreact. So I think a lot of people thought, yeah, whatever, this is an overreaction. But then we started seeing the numbers in New York, and of course in the rest of the world, specifically Italy, start to rise. And we're we're a city that's like a day city, I would say. Unlike New York, where people go out at night and stuff, we're more of like people go out during the day, and there's a lot of restaurants and a lot of bars, and people in LA love restaurant and bars. It's really hard to get them to stop going. So once he shut that down, which I thought was the right call, is when people actually started saying, oh, great, we can't go to the bar. Like, it started out as like, first you can only go and get takeout at the food places, and then he straight up shut it down. I think his response has been decent as far as that goes. What people are really in need of right now is like dealing with rents, like rent payments, mortgages, the fact that, you know, people aren't going to be able to pay those. They should be entitled to rent freezes, because that's a huge issue. We have some of the highest rents here in Los Angeles in particular, but in California in general. And there hasn't been anything on that. Kamala Harris, our senator, has offered $250 per person a month, and it's ridiculous. That's laughable. And you know, they haven't really addressed like the layoffs and all that. People are getting laid off work. People, you know, businesses are shutting down because they can't. They're used to having crowds every day, and so right now, I think the economic situation is worse. I know people are still getting diagnosed with getting sick because it's relatively new here. We just started, I mean, I would say we're like in day 7 or day 6 of like quarantine, but it wasn't shelter in place until the last like 48 hours. So people are still like, it's relatively new. I think you're going to see the numbers go up a lot. People, you know, like I said, we're taking it seriously till a while, and the airport is still open. So yeah, but I think the economic concerns are right now is what I'm seeing being far greater than the health concerns. And it's just going to be a problem when everybody decides to go to the hospital because there's no tests, and, you know, they have issues because there's not going to be enough beds. And I think that's where we're going to see like the chaos, is the fact that we don't have enough beds at all to you know, to have a good response to the disaster.
Is that true that Gavin had took those homeless people off the streets and is putting them in hotels now?
It's some people, and Garcetti is the mayor of Los Angeles, Mayor Eric Garcetti, and he had a lot to do with that, because a lot of the activist organizations, a lot of them that I've worked with as well, have been adamant about that, because they know that the moment the you know, somebody gets infected there, it's going to spread like a virus. There's no way that they're going to be able to put all the homeless people in hotels. They are doing that for some people, but it's just impossible. I mean, we have at least 65,000 homeless people that are accounted for. That's not accounting for the people that aren't accounted. That's not accounting for the people that live in their cars, or are like, you know, staying at people's houses and stuff like that. So we have a huge homeless crisis, and you're right. That is like, that to me is the like disaster waiting to happen, because like as of yesterday, people were, you know, feeding the homeless. They were going to the grocery store and giving them packages like with, you know, just first aid kits and things that they could use. And a lot of these organizations have been really good about it, but there's just not enough open real estate. I mean, there are a lot of empty, you know, McMansions and empty like high rises and things like that, but those are not being used properly to house the homeless. And there's not enough like low income housing built. That's always been the issue, that there's not enough low income housing built. Instead, they built you know, commercial real estate or just really high end luxury apartments that nobody can afford. And so those apartments remain empty most of the time until they're rented, or they might be a vacation home. And so the reality is that a lot of these homeless people are still very vulnerable to this disease. And unfortunately, you know, once that happens, it's going to be a disaster. I mean, I think they're doing what they can, but I think it's a little too late. If we would have had these measures in place prior to that, if we would have had like a healthcare system that, you know, the Anthony Rendon, who is the one who destroyed single payer, and he's a state, I believe, a state senator, and he completely, you know, got rid of that of Medicare for all, SB 526 was the bill. And if we would have had Mayor Garcetti and, and pretty much Newsom deal with the homelessness crisis prior to this, it would have been easier. But now we have pretty much all like the perfect storm coming together, and eventually it's going to cause a giant issue when it happens. And people are doing what they can to help out on their own. But again, it's also putting people at risk, because yesterday when people were doing that, they were all putting themselves at risk by doing that as well.
Don't you find it funny that Trump is moving toward the left and Joe Biden is nowhere to be found on these issues?
I find it hilarious, but I also think it's Trump doing Trump. He's not necessarily moving left. He's just doing what he is being forced to do. I mean, at this point during a crisis, they know that they have to provide to the American people, or there's gonna be riots. This situation could get out of control really, really quickly. And I think he's just doing what the people are asking, because he knows he's running in November. And so he knows that the coronavirus is going to be what he's going to be judged on. So if he doesn't do that, it's obviously going to be an issue. And I think he's being smart by making the Democrats look useless. I mean, Joe Biden is nowhere to be found. I mean, there's trending, where is Joe Biden? Hiding Biden. He is literally supposed to be, the DNC has chosen him to be the nominee pretty much. Right. And he's hiding. He's just hiding, and he is not being presidential. He's not offering anything. Meanwhile, you have Sanders offering virtual town halls and virtual roundtables at every instance he gets. And he's talking about people's concerns, saying we need to do this, we need to do that. And the reality is, had Sanders been president in 2016, we wouldn't be as fearful as we are now, because we would have had the measures in place to deal with this. And if we remember 100 years ago, nearly 100 years ago, we had a Great Depression, and we had a Democratic Socialist president in Franklin Delano Roosevelt when he pushed the New Deal. Now, he did it not because he was necessarily, out of the kindness of his heart, but also because he saw the need for people to get people out of poverty. And if we don't have something like that now, as a result, even prior to this pandemic, right, but even more so now as a result of it, the American economy is going to sink in a way that it's unprecedented. I mean, what has been happening the last few days is unprecedented with the stock market. And when rich people start freaking out, that it's a serious thing. So it's not a lie. It's not a joke. Joe Biden isn't being presidential. And the fact that the Republicans are, putting Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer to shame when they're denying, Trump wants to give people direct money and they're denying it, is basically pushing people to see that the Democratic Party is no longer the answer. And I think we're going to see that if we have a fair election, which we honestly haven't had for years in this country. We're going to see that, though, I think at the very least in November, when it comes to Donald Trump versus the nominee, because the Republican Party can always now attack, if it's Joe Biden, attack from the left. I mean, Joe Biden wanted to cut Social Security, wanted to cut veteran aid. Joe Biden voted for NAFTA. So Donald Trump is going to use that over and over again. He's going to use every single weakness. This is why Joe Biden shouldn't be the nominee, because Joe Biden has absolutely nothing to stand on. Bernie Sanders, however, can say, well, Donald Trump, if we had all these policies in place, we wouldn't have to, react like this. We would have been proactive, and he can attack in that way. And, he can always mock Trump when it comes to the socialism aspect, because, I mean, let's face it, you can call it whatever you want, but what Trump is advocating is giving every American money and suspending, mortgages and suspending evictions. That is like the essential core of what a socialist nation is. And the problem now is that it's so centralized because the national government is doing it. and it's a result of a reaction rather than something that, you know, would have been helpful before this. But it is absolutely hilarious, and the Democrats are pushing people to Trump. That's flat out. They're pushing people to the right, and it's something that I want to mention too, is that we need to be wary of that, because what happened in Germany, for instance, right before the formation of the Third Reich, right before Hitler came into power, was they had a very, very vulnerable population, a working class that was unsatisfied, that an economy that was so fragile, and pretty much Hitler came in offering solutions to people. He offered, yeah, we're going to get you out of poverty, we're going to do this, but by the way, we hate Jews, so okay. But they did that, and they helped people, and this is what they did. And unfortunately, that is what people don't want to talk about. We need to realize that we are pushing this country towards actual fascism. I don't believe Trump is necessarily a fascist. I think we are the entire oligarchy itself that allowed for the existence of Trump is pushing our country towards that. Because if you look at what the DOJ just said, they want to pretty much remove any sort of constitutional right that we have when it comes to the coronavirus. So they're saying, because of the coronavirus, we're going to get rid of habeas corpus, and so we can detain you, question you, and pretty much do anything because of the coronavirus. I mean, I think that's a downward spiral we're facing.
I agree. Fiorella Isabel, that is scary. But I want to talk, you've done amazing reporting on what happened in California. We even go back to 2016, which you brought up, you know, and how you got started with the Convo couch. 2016 was a disaster in California. The Associated Press called the election for Hillary Clinton before even the voting started in California. We can go back to them, but let's talk about 2020. And as I say, you've done amazing reporting on what's going on in California. You go on different websites, whether it's New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, MSNBC, it still says California still has 88% of the vote in, or 90 maybe, depending on what website you look at. Can you talk about California? Why are they still counting? And what happened with all these long lines? We hear about the provisional ballots, the switchover with the NPP voters, that they had to ask for a certain type of ballot. Otherwise, they would have to get an independent ballot, and they weren't able to vote in the presidential election. This is supposed to be a bastion of progressivism in California, and the elections are just a sham there, and, you know, from what I hear and see. Can you talk about all that?
Sure. I mean, California is thought to be by many, you know, the land of progressivism, and the reality is our government is one of the most corrupt. I mean, we have Dianne Feinstein, we have Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer. We have some of the most corrupt politicians that have been in power for so long, and they stay in power through the process, and they don't care about fair elections, much less actually, you know, enacting legislation that helps people. So flat out, that is a lie. California is one of the most corrupt states. In fact, it's almost as corrupt as the South. The only difference is these Democrats are doing the corruption. So when there are elections, it's always Democrats against Democrats. That's the main thing that happens there. Whereas, let's say in a place like Florida, you know, it's always between the Republican and the Democrat, and that's the only difference. But the reality is they're not. So, you know, 2020 was a repeat of 2016. I mean, we tried. We have been on this for like over a year, like a year and a half, that we were talking about this. We went to a meeting with pretty much a representative of the Secretary of State, who pretty much assured us that everything was going to be fine, but we were starting an entirely new voting system in the primary. What he didn't tell people was that this was a test run, that they were going to make 2020 primaries a test run for this system. And the system is a ballot marking device system. So you have, instead of the Scantron-like machines, or instead of the any sort of paper machine, they basically have a ballot marking device, which is a machine that it's supposedly not connected to the internet. And you go and you pretty much have your choices on their digital. It's a whole digital ballot thing, and you pick your choices and you print it out, and then you put it back, you look at it, you put it back in, and that's it. There it goes. The problem with that is, first of all, they told us the machines were open source. They're not at all. And they have this proprietary software where it's owned by these corporations, and a lot of these corporations have questionable ties. I mean, these people are tied to banks, and just really, really, really financial. They have financial investments, and they're private. So that means it's not open source. It means that we can't be like, oh, let me audit this machine. No, you can't do that. And so they lied about that. Another thing that they failed to mention was that the system wasn't really fit to be used. I mean, a lot of the machines weren't fit to be used. They started crashing or spitting ballots out. They started pretty much being, how do I put it? They started like getting like jammed and with the paper. So they had to fix that constantly. And the voter data that's normally in a piece of paper, as far as I know, when I've been to Florida, it's normally on a piece of paper. You look up a voter's information, it's there. The voter information was called an e-poll book. So an e-poll book is an online database that is connected to the internet. That could be messed with if you had any access to it. And what happened is people came in who had changed your registration, and we interviewed poll workers on this. And this is where it gets really frustrating, because we interviewed poll workers and they told us everything that would happen because they had gone through the training, and we were trying to warn people, and people were saying, oh, that's just conspiracy, no way, this is going to be fine. People were really as even Sanders, the Sanders campaign, we mentioned it through one of our friends who was a field organizer to the local LA field office, who said, when she brought it up, said, stop bringing up unsubstantiated theories and conspiracy theories, and like, don't do this. You're going to suppress the vote by talking about this. And she was like, what? Like, you guys, like, come on, like, this is reliable. These are poll workers. These are people that have been following this for a while, blah, blah, blah. And so they completely dismissed that. They had a press conference on independent voting, and Pasta went there to ask I think the California director, his name is Rafa Navar. He straight up asked him, we have this on video, but isn't there going to be an issue with people being given provisional ballots and you guys haven't addressed it? He's like, no, that's incorrect. If you're a new registered voter, if you just registered, you just need to bring any proof of residency, and you'll be fine. You'll get a normal ballot. That's the opposite of what happened. And so what happened is, when people came in there, they weren't found in the poll book. The machines hadn't updated, is what we learned later, is that the machines, for some reason, they hadn't updated. And so you couldn't find people in the rolls who had registered for years, and they couldn't find them. And a lot of the times it took people bringing their sample ballot for them to be found. And sometimes that didn't work. There's a QR code. It didn't like pull people up. You're relying on QR codes, for crying out loud. It's way too high tech for something like that. That's so hackable, and so just reliant on technology. And these people, of course, behind the computers, the majority of them were older. They weren't millennials or younger Gen Zs. They were older people who didn't really know what to do. They were just following prompts, and they had only 1 day of training. The majority of them, 1 day of training. And so they weren't found in the poll book, so they were given provisional ballots right off the bat. And provisional ballots are obviously the famed pink ballots that were very bright pink, and they look like that. And they are pretty much a placebo ballot, is what Greg Palast calls them. And I agree with him, because they have to be validated later on, and a lot of them don't get validated. And so when they're counted, they're still being counted right now as we speak. And so the other issue was that the ballots were being spit out by the machine. So if that happened, you got a provisional ballot. The machines weren't working. So out of 10 machines, maybe half of them were working. And so that the night before, they did a whole, because they had closed down. They went from 4,000 polling locations to 1,000, and less than 1,000 were actually open. And they did this because they were supposedly going to have 11 days to vote. So on the 22nd, all the way to the March 3rd, you had 11 days to vote. So we went to 9 different polling locations, and none of them were open and fit to use except one. The majority of them still had computers in boxes on the 22nd, and they were opened. They started being open on the 29th of February is when most of them started being open. So really, people only had like 4 days to vote. And the reality is, they said they were going to spend money on the campaign ads to show people that they were open. Most people didn't know that these locations were open up until the day of. And they were like, oh, I didn't know. I didn't know this was a different system. They didn't know. I mean, there was just not a good job done of educating people. And so the day came, there was a shortage of poll workers. There was a shortage of machines. Somehow they thought that it was smart to put 5 machines and 2 poll workers in a college campus when all these young people showed up to vote. Then we had 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 hour waits in some spots. I mean, people were voting on the day till past midnight. And we were all like just sending them pizzas, doing what we could, telling these people to stay in. But the reality is some people left because the machines weren't working, because they were given provisional ballots, because they had to go to class, because of whatever they had to do. You're not supposed to wait 3 hours to vote. That's voter suppression. Even 2 hours or an hour is a long time, let alone far longer than that. And so it was everything you could think of went wrong. It was just the voter suppression, along with what I call the election rigging, because there's no way that you're going to tell me that the Secretary of State, Alex Padilla, who has been sued by the ACLU, and Dean Logan, the county clerk, who has been sued by the ACLU twice for election fraud, by the way. He worked in Washington State, and they kicked him out of there for that. And then, of course, he came to California because he knew he could get away with it in Los Angeles. And they're still in power. And if we recall, Alex Padilla was the guy who was campaigning for Hillary Clinton while being Secretary of State in 2016. And guess what? The same thing happened with the provisional ballots. And so I guess the update is we went to the county clerk to observe the counting of provisional ballots. They're very they barely let you observe. I mean, you go in there, but they're always watching you. They're like, they called like their top guy when we went there, and we asked a few questions, and they're like, yeah, well, we have different stages for these provisional ballots, where some of them are yellow, green, and red. Red means that they're invalidated. Yellow means that they have to go to further validation, and green means that they're fine to be sent to Downey, California, which is where they're counted there, and you can go observe that too. But the reality is the majority of these ballots aren't counted, and when you walk in there, you see hundreds of thousands of ballots. It's very depressing. It's where your vote goes to die. And so when we went in there, the majority of the names are Latino names, Hispanic names, and the people validating them, they hire them like seasonally. They're young people that are validating these ballots. They're barely trained, you could tell, because they're asking questions, and they're just doing whatever they need to do to validate these ballots. Now, that is also affected by the coronavirus, because they're not going to have all these people in a room, necessarily to count the ballots. And if they don't count them within a certain amount of time, I believe by the end of this month, they're just not going to be counted. So that's the fiasco that happened. Every single thing went wrong. And I encourage people to watch our coverage of it, because you won't even believe it. It was just a mess. It's so disheartening that we have no democracy in our election system.
So a lot of Latino votes got thrown out, which are Bernie votes, basically, for the majority at least. I want to talk to you about this, and you spoke about this in California. We heard about this at University of Michigan and also University of Michigan State. Can you talk about the voter suppression for the lack of polling places in college towns, and also, to tee up that too, the exit polls, which show Bernie winning? We look at all the exit polls on all the news stations, and it says that Bernie wins on Medicare for all. All these issues that Bernie's standing up for, he's winning in every state. Even Mississippi went for Medicare for all. But he loses the election. There's no investigation by the Sanders campaign. You talked about that,
Yep.
what was going on in Los Angeles with the votes. It seems like they're just like, I don't understand what's Bernie's doing. Like there's no investigations. Independent media like yourself and other shows are doing this, but the Sanders campaign is just falling behind. It's almost like they don't care. So the voter suppression in the college towns and the exit polls.
Yeah, I mean, so Sanders has mentioned the voter suppression in the college towns, in towns like Michigan when that happened. And of course, we saw the last primaries, which were a disaster. We shouldn't have had primaries in Illinois, Arizona, or Florida. It was just ridiculous to have that. When the CDC is saying go quarantine, you know, these state governors and are telling people, yeah, go vote. You know, the Biden campaign telling people to go vote. The Sanders campaign did not tell people to go vote. They actually worked to postpone the primaries. But when that didn't happen, they left it up to the voter. Obviously, you know, it would have been detrimental for them to tell people not to go vote. But at the same time, they can't really say go vote because of the situation. Where the Sanders campaign has failed, in my opinion, largely, and I think in the opinion of a lot of not only critics, but their supporters, is that they've failed to address the election integrity issues regarding beyond voter suppression. So beyond the long lines, beyond the lack of poll workers, beyond the untrained poll workers, beyond the like what we call the front of the house stuff, right? Like it's like, yeah, that's the stuff you can see is the stuff people don't want to talk about, and that is voter election fraud. And that's what actually happened. So election fraud happened in 2016 and Sanders didn't address it. If we recall, activist and election guy Tim Canova, who ran against Debbie Wasserman Schultz, brought up the issue many times and has pretty much been like a go-to guy in regards to that, has been investigating it. And he brought it up. The Sanders campaign ignored it. There was a lot of people that are my friends and organizers, and they brought it up. They were like, here's the information. They gave it to the lawyers. The lawyers said, okay, we'll look at it, but they didn't do anything with it. So to no surprise of mine, Sanders hasn't really been keen on it. I thought that at least they would have more lawyers, and I know that they do have lawyers, but the reality is they haven't touched this. Their reasoning goes as far as, well, they're going to call us sore losers. They're going to say, you know, we're being like, yeah, you know, we're just not accepting the results. But it's also because there's still a belief that this isn't like, there's not enough proof. And even though Sanders knows, I believe he knows what's happening, trying to prove it is very difficult because people want, like, I don't know, they want like an article in the New York Times saying, yes, it's rigged, here's the thing. That's never going to happen, you guys. When the people, the oligarchy owns the power of this whole thing, they're never going to admit that there's something going on. But it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that our elections are anything but democratic. All you have to do is talk about the things you were talking about. Like if Bernie Sanders is if Medicare for all is winning in Mississippi, in Michigan, and all of these places, right, there's no way that Sanders is losing by this amount. It's just completely invalid. And we can talk about the exit polls alone. That's a huge thing because Ted, the guy who's doing the research at www.tdsm, I believe, .com, I think it is, if you just Google TDSM, he's the one that's talking about the exit polls, and he released exit polls for Michigan, California, New Hampshire. I believe he also did pretty much the majority, Texas, the majority of states where there were discrepancies, he's done. And the margins of error for an exit poll is about plus or minus 4. If it's more than that, it pretty much indicates that some sort of election fraud happened, right? And the margins of error when it comes to the Sanders versus Biden are like 8 points, some of them more. It is insane to me that hasn't been brought up, and we have been talking about it nonstop. But it feels like not just Sanders, but a lot of people don't really pay attention to this thing. It's not a sexy topic. Nobody wants to talk about, you know, statistics and numbers and all of that. It's not a topic that gets a lot of attention. I think it started to get more attention after this, unfortunately, because of people saying, whoa, this doesn't make sense. If he, you know, he was winning in these exit polls. And exit polls, just to clarify to people who don't know what they are, they're not a poll that CNN puts out and people just, you know, they're just calling people. They're a poll that happens when people come out after voting. So they're actual data. An exit poll is different than a sort of CNN poll or a college poll, whatever it is. And so that's why the inconsistencies are far too great for it to be nothing. And not only the exit polls, you can talk to the Sanders field organizers, who are largely the ones who know what their, you know, where their neighborhood's going to go, because they get the data. So they have the data, they go canvassing, and the majority of people are like, oh yeah, like Sanders, blah, blah, blah. And so they have this data. And when that doesn't match, it's obviously also sending a red flag. The Sanders campaign could have used their data that they have to pretty much say, hey, this doesn't match either. They could use a multitude of things. And this is where I feel like his supporters, independent media, and the people need to be like, Bernie Sanders, are you gonna talk about this? Because the other thing is, Donald Trump is saying that. He's like, yeah, the Democrats are cheating Bernie Sanders again. And because Sanders doesn't want to be associated with Trump, this is his advisement team. Like they're terrible, right? I mean, they're telling him to do what he should not be doing. They're telling him, oh, well, you don't want to look like you're lifting up Trump and you're agreeing with Trump. They care more about optics than they do about actions. And that's my issue with them. And that's why he needs to literally fire the majority of them and start listening to his supporters who have been with him since 2015, because they know what's going on the ground and the sentiment of people. And I feel like the campaign has lost touch with that. I mean, they're on point when it comes to messaging of what's happening now. But again, a lot of people say, well, what's even the point of saying Sanders is in the race if they're not going to call out the election rigging, if they're just going to continue with the sham of an election, trying to tell us that Joe Biden won Michigan, that he won Flint? Are you kidding me? That Joe Biden is ahead in Washington State, where Bernie Sanders has had the largest rallies, where everybody in King County is asking everybody, hey, who voted for Joe Biden? None of us voted for Joe Biden. I mean, it's a joke. People are like, I don't know many people who voted for Joe Biden. And it's a running joke. And even in California, I'm telling you, we won the state because we were going to win it in a landslide. I mean, we were going to win it in a landslide. And the people here, we were on them like crazy. And they knew that. And they weren't able to do as much. But even with what they did, all the crap that they did, we still won. But that tells you that the victory, like it's a 10-point difference right now. It should have been like a 40-point difference at the very least. I mean, it is ridiculous the amount of rigging that has gone on. And people need to not be afraid to say that that's what it is, because that's what it is. You're not going to tell us that Joe Biden, who is a proponent of NAFTA, won big in Michigan the way he did. He didn't even campaign in a lot of these states that he won. He refused to come to 2 of our Democratic conventions here that we had. He refused to come to them. The guy didn't campaign in Massachusetts. That's off too in Massachusetts. There's no way that Joe Biden won. And I think there are people doing studies on this right now. We're actually going to interview a few of the election integrity specialists. We're going to pretty much talk to them about what they find and how we can move forward. So we're going to be filling you guys in on this. But the reality is, I think this is where Sanders is pretty much sinking his campaign by not addressing this very big elephant in the room, is the election issues that went on.
The lack of fight from Bernie, not taking off the gloves, and not hitting Joe Biden. There's so much, and you've talked about this throughout our podcast today, to hit Joe Biden on. Look at all the lies. The last debate, he lied and lied and lied. Nothing really from Bernie. He did question him a couple of times, but nothing really, hard hitting. We've seen all the lies about the Nelson Mandela lie, civil rights. He said he didn't write the crime bill in the last
Yep.
debate. And then Bernie comes out and says that he's just going to endorse Joe Biden. He says to everybody that he thinks Biden can beat Trump. That's not how you beat Joe Biden, because people are going to say, well, why should I vote for Bernie? If Joe Biden can beat Trump, I might as well. He agrees. He's more of a moderate. I'm a moderate. Let me vote for the person like that. So Bernie is just losing the argument there. And I read an article they just had in the New York Times with Bernie, and it was saying Nina Turner, and David Sirota were pushing Bernie to fight harder, and Bernie and Jane said no, so that was the end of it. So, with Trump, I don't like Trump, but I got to give it to Trump. He calls out the media when they're trying to screw him. And we need Bernie to be more like that. He cares too much. He tries to play the middle. It really bothers a young person like me that's 29 years old. I'm a teacher, and I work at a restaurant part-time. I'm out of work fully right now. I'm 29 years old. My health care is not that great. It kind of sucks. And I need Bernie. I've been, fighting for Medicare for all with Bernie, donating, voting for him, making calls. And I just feel like there's no hope anymore. And, with Joe Biden going to get crushed by Donald Trump, it's 4 more years. The environment's in crisis. You're seeing that in California with the wildfires. What do you feel like as far as hope goes?
I agree with you on every single point. I mean, I think, we have been pushing, and I think supporters like yourself and others need to push Bernie Sanders, whether you write to him, whether you just let it be known in any way, shape, or form you can, whether it's social media, whether it's direct email, whether it is you write him a letter to his house in Vermont. Let him know how you feel, because I think that's what he needs to hear right now. He's assessing. He needs to hear from his supporters. He needs to not hear from his consultants. His consultants are telling him to do the wrong things, and he is listening to them, and he shouldn't be. And he should be listening to the people that got him here in the first place, the people that have donated their hard-earned money, that have pretty much a lot of them quit their jobs just to volunteer for him. And you don't have that in any other candidate, where it's that kind of dedication and that kind of just fortitude. And he's throwing all that away by not taking the gloves off. And the problem, and I'm going to summarize it in this way, that Bernie Sanders is acting like he's in the Senate right now. He's acting like he is going to push legislation through, that needs to work with everybody because he's got to get this done. And his end goal is defeating Donald Trump. The problem with that is he's not in the Senate. He's in a presidential race, and he's competing against Joe Biden. So the number one thing you don't do is prop up Joe Biden, especially Joe Biden, who shouldn't be propped up at all in any way, shape, or form. And especially when people are asking you to take the gloves off, you're completely dismissing that. And it doesn't mean he has to say Joe Biden is a demented idiot who blah, blah, blah. He can say Joe Biden is not mentally equipped to be president of the United States. He has lied multiple times. He is lying to the American people right now. He should use some flat out words. You're lying. And that's what people want to see, because unfortunately, if he doesn't do that, people aren't really going to see a huge difference between him and Joe Biden. And right now, the way the primaries have gone, perception is reality, right? Even though we know that these elections aren't valid, that they're rigged, that Joe Biden isn't really winning, that they're rigging it for him, people are going to perceive Joe Biden as the winner, and that also deflates Bernie's momentum. So instead of deflating the momentum, he needs to up the momentum, and I think he can do that still if he goes after the election issues, if he goes much more toughly after Joe Biden, if he listens to Nina Turner, David Sirota, and Brianna Joy Gray, who have been the ones that have been more aggressive towards the Joe Biden campaign and towards other candidates in general, but they are punching. And he needs to listen to those people. Why? Those people are aware more of the media, of what's going on the ground. They're more in tune with how people are feeling. And so they know more than a consultant trying to strategize and say, well, if you start sounding like Trump, then that's just going to push off the set. That's what they think. Literally, that's what they think. You're going to push away people because those centrists. Bernie Sanders' mistake was going after centrists too much this time. If we look back in 2016, he didn't embrace the identity politics as much. He kind of talked about the economic issues more so, like how, you know, everybody's experiencing poverty, blah, blah, blah. And this time around, he embraced the identity politics. He embraced more of the Trump this, Trump that. And he was doing it to gain a lot of centrist support. And I get it. But the reality is those people were never going to vote for him. And those people are vote blue no matter who anyway. So if he was able to get the majority of independents, the majority of libertarians, the majority of some of the Republicans he got, it would have been easier for him to win. Going after those centrists, it was a problem. And I think he let his consultants tell him to do the wrong thing. But what people should absolutely do is not lose hope. I think, it goes beyond Bernie. It goes beyond Bernie at this point. Like I said, it's time for a third party. It's time for people to rise up, and no better time to do it than now. And I think people should continuously shout out Bernie. Hey, look at these elections. Hey, Bernie, go after Joe Biden. Why should we keep donating if you're not going to do that? Obviously, right now he's focused on coronavirus, but when it comes to anything else that's going to happen, any other debate or any sort of primary, he needs to go much harder. And if Bernie doesn't do that, people have to face that's fine. And he created this movement. Be the leaders. Stop waiting for people to tell you what to do. Go protest, go organize, go do something. And I know it's hard right now because we're obviously quarantined, but start organizing, because this is gonna stop. We're eventually gonna get through this pandemic, and eventually things are going to resume. And once that happens, we need to have plans set in place as to what we're going to do, how we're going to do this, etc. And people need to stop putting politicians on pedestals. Politicians will always disappoint you. We need to not make heroes out of people, not put them to a point where we're pretty much edifying them. They are people with faults. They're not always going to do what we want them to do. Bernie Sanders has been in the political spectrum for 40 plus years, and he's tired. He's 78 years old. I'm not giving him the excuse. I'm simply saying I think Bernie Sanders is the guy who is going to do what he thinks he can do to get the most. This is why he endorsed Hillary Clinton in 2016, because he went and got the Unity Reform Commission and got the super delegates to be gone on the first round. He got all these things. That's not enough this time, though. His supporters aren't going to do that. They're not going to vote. When Bernie Sanders tells his supporters, if and when he tells his supporters to support Joe Biden, they're going to tell him, no, Bernie, we're not doing that, and this is where you lose us, and that's it, and that's where your legacy ends, which is going to be sad if that happens, because that's it. I mean, that's what he was there to do. Kind of just pretty much show the corruption in our entire system, wake people up, and maybe that's all he was here to do. And it's unfortunate because he's we should have him as president, but I think we have the president we deserve right now in America. I really think we do. And I don't want to go blame voters, but I do want to say that, it's designed like this, right? The system makes people work, like you were talking about, working 2 jobs as a teacher. You shouldn't have to. You should be working 1 job. You shouldn't have to work at a restaurant to do this. Obviously, restaurants are closed now, and people are working from home if you're a teacher. But the reality is that shouldn't exist. And so the system is designed to keep people tired, uneducated, and focused on somebody else causing their problems. That's maybe an immigrant or another person, instead of the people behind the scenes who are the oligarchs, the establishment politicians. Those people are the ones we need to focus on. The battle isn't left versus right now. The battle is top versus down. And I think once people realize that that's what we're facing here, if anything, this pandemic and what's going on makes it ever clear that that's what we have at our hands. And if we have looked to the fall of Rome and France and what's going on right now worldwide, there are movements, there are uprisings, and right now we're Rome before the fall, and we need to be careful, because either we're going to take over, it's going to be a people's movement, or it's going to be something violent, and we don't want it to get to that. So
what do you think Bernie will do?
I think there's a difference between what he should do and what he will do. I mean, I think I was told by a source close to the campaign that he's going to stay in it to the convention. However, there are people trying to convince him to drop out, and some of them, I am sure, are his own people. And the reason being, there is a lot of the neoliberals and the Democrats framing it. Bernie Sanders needs to just drop out and endorse Biden because we need to focus on coronavirus, and you know, we pretty much have chosen Joe Biden already, and yeah, we need to focus on coronavirus and beating Trump, blah 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 blah. This is a crisis. Bernie shouldn't be selfish. He needs to do the opposite of that. He needs to take it all the way to the convention. He needs to fight, and he needs to point out the election issues. I don't necessarily think he's going to do that. He absolutely has to if he wants to win. I think he needs to take the gloves off on Joe Biden. I don't necessarily think he's going to do that. I think that's exactly what he needs to do to win. I think he's going to continue and pretty much focus on the coronavirus pandemic and act presidential like he's been doing, because the strategy there is, you know, like, this is the guy that should be president, acting presidential. You guys should vote for him. However, I don't think it's enough. I think he needs to go after Joe Biden. I think he needs to show that Joe Biden is inept. He's not anywhere to be found, and he needs to comment on that. And I think he needs to address the primary issues. Like, we need to have, I don't even trust primaries being vote by mail at this point. You know, that's the thing. Like, that, I think that's our only option right now. Maybe unless we suspend everything till June. And even then, we don't know how long this thing is going to last, and what the circumstances are going to be. But is there even going to be a convention? That's another question. You know what I mean? And like, I think what Bernie Sanders doesn't need to do, though, is drop out. I think that's the last thing he needs to do. More than ever right now, he has a case because he can prove that Joe Biden is not there, that Donald Trump is now enacting these policies that are going to make him look like a hero. And that's a dangerous trajectory towards fascism, because you know, he's going to be the one providing it. We're going to have people saying, look, the Republicans are giving us social safety nets and blah blah blah, and then you're going to prove that to be true unless you have somebody like Bernie Sanders at the presidency at that level. And so he absolutely needs to continue fighting, and he needs to listen to his base 100%, and that's something that Trump does. And that's what has him as a quote unquote populist. And Bernie Sanders was, in 2016, I believe, the antithesis of that. He was a populist from the left, and Donald Trump was a populist from the right. He ran as draining the swamp. He ran as being an anti-interventionist. You know, he ran as of being America first. Obviously, most of that isn't true. But what is true is that he's running a populist campaign, and Bernie Sanders needs to push back on the centrism that the consultants are telling him, and embrace the populism of his campaign, and forget of offending a few centrists that aren't ever going to vote for him. You know, they're not his friend. Joe Biden isn't his friend. He needs to stop saying that. But that's the thing. That's Bernie Sanders is a stubborn guy. He's a guy that, you know, pretty much is pragmatic, more pragmatic than revolutionary, I think. And I think a lot of people have realized that. Like, he's not, you know, he's not necessarily the 1986 Bernie that wants to like burn everything down. Like, he's kind of, you know, been in the system for a while, and now he's had to deal with it. And so he's not necessarily at the level we are. And that's something that we have to face. But, you know, what he has to do is listen to us and say, look, these are our lives. You know, you mentioned the wildfires here. You mentioned climate change on top of the economic disaster of the pandemic. We haven't even dealt with climate change. We're not. I mean, tomorrow there could be a giant earthquake in California, for all we know. And like, what's going to happen to the hospitals then? You know, what's going to happen to society then? Any sort of unmitigated disaster that can happen, whether it's a wildfire, hurricane, a tornado, earthquake, or any sort of environmental change, whether it's the melting of polar ice caps that lets out more diseases. I mean, all of these things. We haven't even talked about war. And the foreign policy and what happened with Iran, what we're doing to Iran right now. We're sanctioning them, and all the things that are happening right now. We haven't even addressed that. If anything, we're so vulnerable right now. Anything else goes wrong, that's it. We're just going to fall apart. So more than ever, we need somebody like Bernie Sanders because of the precarious situation we're in. And he needs to argue that. He needs to argue that more than ever, we need a Bernie Sanders for president because he has the social safety nets, he has the foreign policy, he has the healthcare, he has the education, he has all these things that are going to be needed to bring back society from a depression, from this disaster. Again, we had FDR. Without FDR, I don't know where this country would have been. And so if we don't have that, this country is going to fall apart. And he needs to argue it like that with alarming urgency.
It's already fallen apart. And I mean, you see it and I see it here with the homelessness and the affordable housing problem. And Bernie Sanders has, and I will end with this, Bernie Sanders has got the case. I'm presidential right now. I'm out there doing town halls, speaking with the American people. Joe, you're not around. Joe, you already said you're going to veto Medicare for All on Lawrence O'Donnell's show. And that's not what we need in a pandemic. So it's just easy as that. And people will listen to that. You know, but Fiorella Isabel, thanks so much for coming on the program. I greatly appreciate it. Can you tell people where they can find out you and also donate to the Convo Couch, please?
Sure. So people can find us on YouTube at the Convo Couch, THE Convo, CONVO, Couch, COUCH. We're also on Instagram under the same name. We're also on Twitter. You can find me on Twitter at Fiorella_IM. And we are also on a platform called Rockfin. It's a cryptocurrency platform. It has a really clean stream. It's kind of an alternative to YouTube that's building. And we're also on there, and it's free. It's free to join, but you can endorse us as well. We have a Patreon under the Convo Couch as well that we always love having new Patreon members. And we have a GoFundMe for the primaries. Now, right now, we're not traveling as much, obviously, for obvious reasons. But once this picks up again, we plan on continuing our coverage. We actually want to do a documentary on the elections and what happened in general on this whole thing that's happened so far. And our intention was to go to Milwaukee, and I hope we still can go there. We really should fight to have this convention. So check us out at our GoFundMe as well. It's under the Convo Couch. And thank you for having me on. Appreciate it.
All right, Fiorella Isabel, thanks so much for coming on Fire Breathing Rob. We greatly appreciate it.